So today we're talking about global expansion in a remote world. We have seen so many impacts as a result of COVID over the last 2 years, some unexpected, some understandable, lots negative, some positive, but one of the key impacts has been our style of and approach to work. So the sudden closure of many offices ushered in a new era, and the shift to remote work has many businesses really rethinking their global strategies. A permanent shift to remote work and increased business expansion outside the US could trigger a trend toward a more global workforce. However, before you jump headfirst into global expansion, it's a good idea to take a closer look at some of the challenges and opportunities to be found. So I'm joined by Jackie Flatley, HR Director at Lacework, and Dr. Shan Nair, President at Nucleus, to talk about global expansion in more detail. When and why you should take the leap, uniting different cultures and ways of working, and the complexities of HR compliance. And remember, as a thank you for joining us today, you will be receiving an ebook titled 2022 Global Expansion, Recovery, and Consolidation. So welcome, Jackie and Shan. Let's start with some introductions. Why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and exactly what excites you about global expansion in a remote world? Jackie, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Sarah. So yes, I'm Jackie Flatley. I'm HR Director for EMEA and APAC with Lacework. So we're a cloud security startup. We have close to 1,000 people globally, and we're spread across the US, Canada, APAC, and EMEA. So our global expansion has mostly happened over the last 18 months. So throughout the pandemic, we've hired people either directly or through a PEO in 2 countries in APAC and 11 and counting here in EMEA. I'm based in Dublin in Ireland, and I'd say there are 2 things that excite me most about global expansion in this new remote world. So firstly, in the war for talent that we all know exists, getting access to different people and talent is necessary. And secondly, I think the opportunity that exists for people, like for us all, to broaden our horizons and potentially look to do something a little bit different is very exciting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Shan, over to you.
Hi, I'm Shan Nair, and I have got about 15 plus years of experience in helping US companies set up and operate abroad across all of the parts of the world, Latin America, Canada, EMEA, and APAC, and as well as South Asia. The one thing that excites me with my role is that no 2 client problems are ever the same. Sometimes the scenarios may be similar, but they're never the same. And that is the main excitement and interest that I have in my role.
Sounds like supply chain. No 2 days and no problems are ever the same. So let's begin then by taking a look at some of the core considerations around setting up an international entity. So when is the right time to do that, Jackie?
Yeah, so I'll keep it high level, Sarah, because I really think the right time will probably be different for every organization. But broadly speaking from experience, I'd recommend that companies have some sort of internal checklist or guiding principles or geo expansion strategy in place that will help determine the when and the where. It's probably not a HR checklist, but rather based on growth plans and business strategy. So depending on a person's business, this could be based on maybe access or proximity to customers or potential revenues that have been identified in the country or in the region. So I'd suggest then that there's a second layer to this, and that's a deep dive into things like ease of doing business. So for example, are wet signatures required on everything? And if they are, is that possible or practical for you? What's the employment law landscape? So do we need employee representatives or workers' councils? If we do, what impact will that have on how we do business? And then available talent pools. So maybe using something like LinkedIn Talent Insights to make sure that the talent actually exists in the country for the roles that we're going to want to fill there.
Absolutely. Great points there. And so, Shan, what are the requirements? Is there like a set structure, or do they differ from region to region?
The requirements actually can be driven, funnily enough, sometimes by culture. So, for example, just last week, I was talking to a company that wants to set up in Singapore, they want to do it very cost effectively, but the person they want to hire in Singapore is telling them that he can't really make sales with credibility without having a business card that shows that he's the head of a Singapore subsidiary. Status is very important in the Far East. And there I have to tell the company that I actually agree with the VP you want to hire. I don't think that you will achieve a lot of sales without actually investing in some infrastructure in Singapore. So often that can be a cultural issues, can be a driving force, business culture. Sometimes a customer can be a driving force. So for example, in Germany, I had a client that had Daimler-Benz as a customer. Daimler-Benz insist on the company having a local GmbH, a local subsidiary, without which they wouldn't contract. So sometimes the customer can drive it. So there are many factors, but one has to look at each circumstance in its own way, and it's different for every company, what they need to do and how they actually plan the expansion.
Yeah, different companies and different countries and so many different requirements that you have to look through to really figure out what is right for you. And it's a bit overwhelming, and that's why we're talking about this today. So what are some of the barriers or challenges that we're seeing around considering setting up an international entity? Jackie, I'm going to start with you and then go over to Shan.
Yeah, I think a challenge can be not having the, and I use this loosely, but strategy I mentioned above in place early enough. And instead you end up taking almost a scattergun approach to your expansion. So let me give you an example. Perhaps you find someone in, let's say, Denmark. She's top talent. You absolutely have to have her. So you set up an entity in Denmark to hire this person. And of course, that has administrative and financial costs associated with it. And then what happens? Do you have customers in the country or the region that she can support? Have you considered what other roles might be needed there? Does the talent exist there for further expansion? Can you set up benefit plans consistent with what you want to do as a company if you've just got one person there? So ultimately, I think not having your strategy in place in time is probably the biggest challenge that people will run into. And if you do take that scattergun approach that I mentioned, you'll end up playing catch up down the line and struggling to get the strategy in place to kind of rectify what you've done before.
Absolutely, Shan.
I completely agree with Jackie. In fact, there are several factors that will go into the strategy, into a strategy plan. One factor is tax. How do you, because a lot of the clients that are tech company clients are making losses, so they don't want to pay excessive amounts of corporation tax in the foreign country. So what should your tax structure be? What are your, where are your likely customers going to be? Because that's probably where you're going to be hiring the majority of your employees. So typically you'd want a plan that, depending on how thinly or thickly you are expanding abroad, you would either have a US international holding company that would register for payroll and do things like that, you know, very low infrastructure registrations in some of the countries where you may hire 1 or 2 people and no more. Or you may actually set up a local subsidiary in a core country in a region, like say Germany for Europe, or Singapore for the Far East, or Brazil for Latin America, and hang additional registrations off it as you need to hire people. You also should factor in potentially using a PEO in countries where you might find a very attractive employee that you have to have, but you're unlikely to have customers. And a PEO solution or an OCR solution, and there is a subtle but distinct difference between the two, may be an appropriate solution for you in those countries. So a lot of factors come into play. The credibility for selling, where the customers are, the tax structure, and there is a delicate balance that you have to put in place between all of these, because you can't get any one of them perfectly tuned in. You have to kind of tune them all in to the maximum extent possible, but none of them will be perfect.
Right. And what's a PEO or an OCR? Can you expand on that for me?
A PEO is a professional employer organization. It's very common, and I think everyone in the US knows about it. The company, you basically lease your employee through that company. An employer of record is more typically what you would find in countries like Philippines, etc., where there are call centers, where you actually have a contract with a local company that provides employees that work for you under that contract. It's a subtle difference because in the one case, you're a co-employer. In the other case, you may have a deemed co-employment risk if it's in a European country, but you probably won't in a Far Eastern country.
Interesting. And thank you so much for expanding on that and providing the difference between the two, because I think we've heard that acronym a couple of times so far. So I want to make sure that we've got a good understanding moving forward. And so my last question in this segment around the international entity and whether you should set one up or not, how can it help your global expansion plans? Jackie, I'm going to start with you and then we'll go to Shan.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think there's a natural continuation from what Shan just said there, actually, because everything goes back to this strategy into whichever geo you're looking to expand in. Ultimately, whether you're setting up an entity, whether you're hiring through PEO or whether you're going with some other arrangement, has to be part of that plan. So setting up an entity will be the longer term solution, in my opinion. And we in Lacework, we have all of the situations that we've mentioned previously here. So really, that I think the answer there is that the entity setup depends on what your long-term plans are in this situation. So whether you're going to have people long-term, whether you're hiring at volume in the country, whether you have customers, whether you have talent, all of the things we mentioned before.
So you really need to think about the future before you can even plan for the present, right? You need to think about your ultimate goals in those regions. Shan.
Exactly.
Yes, you do. So, and that's why typically you would, depending on where you're expanding, set up a subsidiary, wholly owned subsidiary at some point in your expansion phase. So when you hire the first person, it may be a PEO. Then you may have a number of PEO'd employees all over the place. Then you develop your plan to rationalize all this. At that point, you'll set up a subsidiary. If it's in Europe, Netherlands is a great place because Netherlands has got tax treaties with the maximum number of countries of any country in the world. If it's in Asia Pac, a lot of companies used to go to either Singapore or Hong Kong, but because of the political disturbances in Hong Kong, Singapore is a more favored location. Certain countries like Japan, you can't do business without a business card saying that I am a general manager of a GK. So there could be a number of, but you would typically park a subsidiary down in a region and then hang employees off it if they're in other countries in that region to the maximum extent you can. So you don't want to have subsidiaries everywhere because the cost of setting them up and supporting them can be quite substantial. You want to just have one per region generally.
And those are great points to note. Netherlands in Europe. I had no idea. So thanks so much for sharing that. We are going to put up our first poll. So the question that we're going to ask you is, are you planning to expand internationally this year? So go ahead and put in your responses while we continue to have this discussion. We want to hear from you as to whether you are planning to expand internationally this year as well. So we'll leave that up and I'll come back and let you know the answers just in a minute. It looks like right now we're at 67% yes and 33% no. Actually, that has just changed. We've got 50% yes and 50% no as well. So one of the most important considerations, if not the most important, is people. People are often the driving force of a business, but people and the culture that surrounds and informs them vary massively from place to place. Just because something works well in one country doesn't necessarily mean that that will be the case in another, right? So let's look into that a little bit more in detail. When establishing a new entity, how does a company learn and embrace a new culture? Genuinely, bringing it to the heart of a US brand to work with sensitivity and understanding. Jackie?
I think one of the first things to consider is your attitude and your approach to global expansion into new regions. And I guess in this case, we're talking about expanding outside of the US. A philosophy that I've seen work really well in the past is global where possible and local as necessary. I think you can take this and you can apply it in lots of different ways and to many different scenarios. If I stick to HR for a moment and go back to my earlier example where I mentioned benefits, Culturally, people have different expectations of everything in different countries. It could be because of local statutory entitlements, it could be norms in society. And so a good example here is whether or not a company includes dependents in their benefit plans. If they do, who's defined as a dependent? This can vary massively around the world. So I think having that open-minded approach and understanding that consistency isn't always necessary, it isn't always best, is a really good starting point. And then I'm going to slightly contradict myself, and I'll talk about where I think consistency is needed. Employee experience is one part of defining culture, and making sure that that feeling and that experience that people have working in your company is consistent, regardless of who you are, where you are. It's so important, but it also takes effort. It may not just happen naturally. So I'll give an example from Lacework, where I work, where we improved on something that wasn't a thoughtful, or maybe let me say good experience, but had no ill intent. So we do a monthly exec Q&A. It's a fantastic, candid, free-for-all with our co-CEOs and the exec team. So bear in mind that 18 months ago, we didn't have anybody based outside of the US or Canada. So this monthly meeting took place at 11 a.m. Pacific on a Friday morning. But 11 a.m. Pacific on Friday morning is 7 p.m. in Ireland and 8 p.m. for my colleagues in France and Germany on a Friday evening. So attending this call was probably the last thing any of us wanted to do, but it's a great call. It really adds value. So we were able to give this feedback, we were able to explain the situation, and now the meeting's at a much more sociable 9 a.m. Pacific on a Tuesday. And the kind of second layer of evolution with that is that to ensure that we are really thinking global, our growing team in Australia now have a monthly session of their own at a time that works for them in their region.
That is really some great points, right? When we think about setting up a meeting, we now have to take into account the time zones and things like that. How important are principles? Because I know that I talk to a lot of companies about their values and their principles and things like that. How important is having principles and really sticking to those and having everybody sort of follow those types of principles? Jackie?
I think it's easier said than done.
Okay.
To be perfectly honest, we have a company goal, let's call it, to go global. And that's how important this is to us. And I think everything that you do has to be done with intent. So that spreads right across the company and the way we operate. And in particular, it relates to meetings. We talk, like every company, we talk a good talk. We talk about, making sure that meetings are within time zones. When the reality comes, it's challenging. If you take my previous example, we can't do a meeting where our Sydney, France, Dublin, and US, and bear in mind the size of the US colleagues are all on it together. So you need to have your principles, and then you need to have your common sense. So yeah. I think once you're really operating with intent and be that positive intent and thoughtful intent, you're halfway there.
Absolutely. And I am such a big fan of intention and awareness. And I think they bring so much more to that global conversation. So Shan, working the other way, how does the US culture translate and feed into those new regions that we're talking about?
I think basically you can summarize it, I think, very succinctly. Every business has a vision and a mission and a culture, and it's different for each business. That's something that a business cannot compromise on. Basically, everyone working in that business, anywhere in the world, has got to sign on to that. Otherwise, it's not going to work out for them or for the business. But how you then implement it is driven by cultural and social factors. So, so long as the employees are signed on to that basic 3 principles of the business, how they actually execute it should be left to fit and mold into the local business environment. And I think that's quite important. That's not that important in Europe, because the European culture and the American culture at the end of the day are not that different, when it comes to basics. But it is significant outside Europe, especially in countries like India, China, Far East. So for example, in China, if you have a meeting agreed for 10 o'clock, it's considered really passé to turn up at 10 o'clock and go straight into the meeting. You should have some social small talk before you actually do it. Otherwise, you basically put people off, put the customer or potential customer, you could put the potential customer off. So how you actually do it now and how you win the business has got to be left to the local employees, if they're sales employees, to actually devise, plan, and execute. So I think that's the important point. The second point, I think, is that when you have a global grouping of employees, and there are generally relatively small numbers of employees distributed widely, feedback is very important, upward feedback. So an appraisal shouldn't just be, I'm telling you how you're doing your job. It should be, please tell me how you think I'm doing my job and what can I do to make it easier for you to get the things done that you need to do. So getting employee feedback and being in constant communication with employees in that region is actually quite important. Because remember, if you've only got, say, 4 or 5 employees in a country, all it needs is just one bad egg in the basket to ruin all the eggs. So I think those are the 2 main points I would make when it comes to expanding internationally from an HR perspective.
Yeah, and really being aware of the different cultures and the different backgrounds of the people that are within your workforce and some of the parameters around that. Like you said in that really good example of the fact that, you know, there's small talk that should be done at the beginning of a meeting. And those are real nuances that we really need to focus on to really be successful expanding globally. So now let's talk about online meetings, right? Because we are now doing more and more virtually, and we have employees on the same calls from around the world. You know, there's different rules, regulations, expectations. So walk us through what people need to think about. And Jackie, how do you conduct your international meetings? Jackie, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. I'm going to answer the question slightly differently, if you don't mind, Sarah. I'll hold my hand up and say we're still learning, we're still evolving, we're still figuring out what does life in a post-COVID world, especially in a world where we didn't exist before COVID, look like. So we didn't have anybody in the regions. We didn't have a company with EMEA, APAC, and AMER employees prior to this.
Right.
And an area we're dipping our toe into, and I know some companies do this really well, is looking at what can be done async versus concurrent, so we can truly allow for global collaboration and have location not be a factor. So yes, we do meetings, we do lots of meetings, we do Zooms, we are mindful of all of the things that I suppose are obvious when we've all been on Zooms for the last 2 years, things like camera on, camera off, scheduling during core hours, meeting etiquette, and that kind of thing. But what we want to do better is consider, why are we holding meetings that we have people in together? So what's the outcome? Are we looking for an update? Are we asking for a decision to be made? Is there preparation to be done in advance? Are we inviting the right people? How are we managing that when all those people aren't in the same place? And a possible solution to that is through async working. And by that, I mean collaboration spaces, practices where people work on projects together in almost a follow the sun model, and having that environment where not everybody needs to be working on the same thing at exactly the same time, but we're still really productive and high performing. So I would say that having a global remote team lends itself to this. It's maybe a more modern and future-proofed way of collaborating and working. And I think that there's a number of things right now that potentially would have been seen as conflicts in the past, but now they have to coexist. So how do we be remote but be together? How do we be async but also be concurrent? How do we be distributed and centralized? How do we be global and local? How do we be agile and stable? Right. So I think it's a whole new world that we're coming into now, and a lot of the online stuff is kind of second nature to us, not necessarily correct, but second nature to us at this stage. But I would say that there's an evolution of that can happen to make us really, really successful.
Yeah, it's great points. And embracing time zones, right? Because a lot of times we're looking at time zones very differently and in a negative light, but maybe turning that around, looking at it positively, because, you know, when somebody on the team is maybe sleeping, the other person is awake and can be moving the project forward. And sort of, so changing that mindset as well, I think is a little bit more important, or is important as well. Shan, what are your thoughts on this?
Actually, quite different to Jackie's because I'm coming from a service background. So Nucleus basically sells time. Time is money. Therefore, when you have a meeting with a client, you want to minimize the charge to the client and maximize the value that the client gets from the meeting.
True.
Therefore, the first step is to ensure that, and I try and encourage my colleagues to do this before a meeting, issue an agenda so that there's a focus. Second, check how many of us actually need to be there in the meeting. Put the minimum number of people that need to be there in the meeting. We don't need people just sitting there in a meeting. Third, we don't really want to have a meeting about a meeting. We want a meeting about which results in a set of actions and agreements coming out of it. Record those, put them on a work tracker and execute on them. So it's a slightly different perspective because we're talking mainly of meetings with clients. Internal meetings actually in Nucleus, we don't have that many. I have one meeting with my client service directors once a month that lasts about an hour and a half. But otherwise, most of our work is done through email or maybe the odd meeting, like I would say meeting like 15 minutes, no more, generally. So internal meetings, actually, we have very little.
I'm with you on that. So I only have one meeting a month with my team and they're spread out all over. And then otherwise we do it by email or mostly through Slack. So there's a lot of great ways to be able to do that in a variety and a variety of different options now that I think are available to us. Now we're going to put up another poll. And the question that we have for you is, do you currently employ remote international workers? I also want to give a shout out to Scott for putting his LinkedIn profile in the chat. So if everybody wants to connect with each other, feel free to do that in the chat and connect with each other, because that's what these discussions are all about. And also, please participate in the poll. We want to hear from you as well. Right now, we've got 67% of you saying yes, 33% of you saying no. We're going to leave that up for just a minute more, and then we will share those answers with you. So let's talk about being compliant. Right? I think that we've talked about a lot already, but we have not touched on compliance yet. So can you talk us through some of the challenges when it comes to HR compliance when we're looking at expanding globally? Shan, sending that one over to you.
All right. The first step is when you expand globally is you've got to hire people. So essentially, you have to know what questions you cannot ask in an interview because often that list varies by country or certainly by region. The most sensitive region in that respect is Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And generally you would not, it's not a good idea to ask questions about age, disability, sexual orientation, pregnancy, race, and religion. Those are all emotive topics that should be avoided. So I think really that's the first step. The second step is to be sure you know what the rules and regulations in each country where you're hiring are. So for example, what is the minimum number of days of leave you have to give an employee in the UK? What are the employees' paternity rights or maternity rights? So it's a good idea to do some HR background research before you even start the first interview and to know exactly what you can ask and what you cannot ask. That's what I would say is the first step.
Yeah, that's such great advice. And so going back to the poll, do you currently employ remote international workers? 60% of you said no, and 40% of you said yes. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. And now we're going to go over to Jackie. How are differing policies and procedures managed? How do you communicate and educate sort of the wider team ongoing, which is an important part of that communication that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so I'll go back, Sarah, to what I mentioned previously, which was we try to be global where possible and then local where necessary. So if we take a step back, it's important to have your philosophy on the various topics that come up, and then you can customize it as appropriate. So I'll give you an example of teams getting together during COVID times. we had a company viewpoint. It overarched everything that we put in place. But then the specific measures tended to vary slightly based on a lot of local requirements. So for example, in the US, you can ask people to provide proof of vaccination, whereas in Europe, you can't. What we try to do, at a high level is not get into different policies for everything in every country. Tie back to having a company viewpoint that can be localized where we need to. But to kind of build on what Sean said in his last response to you there, education is also key. I'm obviously based in Europe, and I have worked with global stakeholders in most of my previous roles and my current role. And again, there is no ill intent in 99.9% of what people are doing. They're absolutely operating with positive intent, but a lack of knowledge. And so in most cases, you do need to have some local support. And that can be in the form of internal people based locally. It can be through external companies like Nucleus or any other type of company, but being able to get that solid advice that tells you exactly what you need to do in a country is vital, because there are those little differences that could lead you into trouble in the future.
Absolutely. And I think also part of the discussion is really talking about not only embracing time zones, but embracing cultures, right? Having maybe some of your employees share with you, what's in their world locally, so that everybody can sort of get a good understanding of the culture that everybody is coming from and what that looks like, either both personally and from a business standpoint as well, so that everybody can really understand. And that kind of goes back to Sean's point about education, right? And just leaning in to understand. And so a big topic is diversity and inclusion. And so what does diversity and inclusion look like when you're expanding globally from a hiring standpoint? Jackie, I'm going to start with you and then go to Sean.
Sure. I think there's a couple of different elements, and it's a tricky question to answer actually, because if you take a step back, some local regulations don't actually allow us to measure diversity easily because of what you can or can't ask candidates or employees, as Sean alluded to earlier. So if you're talking about tracking or about metrics, there isn't really a level playing field in global organizations. So if we approach this then from a different perspective, whether you're talking about diversity, inclusion, equity, equality, belonging, really these topics should be part of every element of the employee journey. So starting with talent attraction, going through onboarding, performance management, development, succession and retention, workforce planning, separation, all of these, let's call it diversity as an overarching way of describing it, but diversity should touch on each of those. And a way we can do this, and I think you actually were just going there before this, Sarah, is through ERGs, so employee resource groups. Here we're allowing communities to have an opportunity to come together as allies, to support each other, to influence, to educate. And when you're expanding globally, there's great enhancement to these ERGs. There's a lot of new perspectives brought into play. Just to close out on the education part, I think like all companies, we need to ensure that we have guiding principles in place that will help us remove any bias that might start to exist as you expand globally. It could be distance bias, it could be cultural bias. It is important to have that education element to what you're doing as well.
Yeah, and before you go into it too, right? I think you really need to know a lot about the culture before you even start having some of those conversations. Sean, what do you think about that, and what do you think about the diversity and inclusion aspect?
Think about that fully, because just 3 weeks ago, I had an email come to me from a client saying, Chinese client saying, I don't like Japanese. And I thought to myself, wow, that company needs some HR policies put in place. But I think essentially I would agree with everything Jackie said there in terms of diversity and inclusion. But maybe some of the aspects can be handled through the employee handbook being customized for local country rules and regulations. I think quite apart from the kind of soft HR, which is what we're talking about right now, there's also the hard HR aspect that the more you can put into a handbook, the more flexibility the employer has to change the terms as and when circumstances direct. Some countries also, like Russia, for example, and Japan, have to have local handbooks. In Japan, I think they call it a work rules book. Russia has a long word description that I can't even begin to pronounce. But essentially, you have requirements. So you could formalize some of what Jackie has said, not totally, but some of it through customizing your handbook to be local country specific.
Really, really interesting. I wasn't really thinking about that handbook, but it is such an important document when you're looking at expanding globally and having a source of reference, right? We've been talking about principles, but the handbook can be such a really good source of reference. Now, I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, make sure to put that in the Q&A so that we can get to them before the top of the hour. And so my last question to you on this, Shan, is how do you monitor team performance with a global team, right? That's, I think, the question on everybody's mind is that you've got everybody sort of working remotely, but how do you monitor team performance? And I would assume that in each location, there's also different rules and regulations around that as well.
I think less so if you manage the whole process objectively. So my simple answer to how do I monitor team performance within Nucleus is simple. I monitor it through the extent to which the person has achieved the objectives they've been set.
Fair.
And the objectives that are set are basically then they're not subjective, they are numerical, they are things that can be measured. So for example, client feedback. If you're a client services director, clients are asked not too often to irritate them, but from time to time, can they give feedback on the quality of service on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is lousy and 5 is superb. Anything below 4 is an issue. So you've got to find out why the client's saying that, how we can fix it, and more to the point, how many clients are saying that, because that in turn drives your effectiveness as their go-to person. At a more junior level, it will be things like, when a review happened of a file that you've created for, say, payroll purposes, where it's very important to get payroll correct. How many times in the last 3 months have errors been picked up? Because they're all logged in the review. So long as the criteria are objective and measurable, there can be no criticism of bias. And indeed, there can't be any bias. So it's really that is the tool we tend to use internally.
So KPIs and then external feedback is really important when sort of monitoring how things are going remotely.
Yes.
Great. So we're going to put out another poll. So if you were in the 40% that said yes to our last question, we want to ask you directly, are you hiring them as direct employees? So if you could go ahead and put in your answer while we get to the next section. And so let's get to it. So talking about technology, it's really allowed us, particularly over the last 2 years during COVID, to truly open up the world, working remotely, working flexibly, new platforms for communication. It has helped to create a global borderless workforce, but that in itself creates a new set of issues that many companies just may never have considered. So Jackie, let's start with some examples on your side about what that's looked like for you.
Yeah, so actually, Sarah, as I was thinking about this question, the global borderless workforce that you mentioned is what really stood out to me. And it's something that we didn't talk about here today, but the technology that we have and the ability to work from anywhere with that technology has, in both my current company and my previous company, created some issues for us that we didn't see as much pre-pandemic or pre-COVID, which is people working where we don't expect them to be. There are so many issues with that, both from a company and a personal perspective. There's issues with data transfer. If you're in a certain country, transferring that data to other countries, when you're in the country that we expect you to be in, that you're contracted out of, that tends to not have any issues because we've verified it, we know where you are. If you're not where we expect, that leads to all sorts of problems. When you go beyond that, there can be tax issues for both the individual and for the company, health and safety issues, benefits, employment law, you name it. So actually the technology has allowed us to do so much, but it's also created a small bit of a monster that we need to know how to manage as companies. I think it's all a learning process. Going back to, you know, you and I both seem very aligned on intent. We've positive intent in everything we do. We can still be taken by surprise. So we need to be agile. We need to adapt when we come across something that we didn't expect, or, you know, a different way of doing something that we didn't know about. We don't know everything. These things do come up, and in this new world, we have to be able to deal with them.
So how do you express that to your team? Is that, you know, if you're not in the place where we have hired you for that position and you decide to go on a 3-month, I don't know, hiatus to another country, but you're still going to be working from that country, how do you even, you know, is it in your handbook? Is it in your policies? Is it something that you mention up front? Is it, you know, what happens if they don't tell you and they just go and then you find out later? I know this is throwing a lot at you, but I'm really curious about this aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, with this world of blurry backgrounds, I told you I'm in Dublin. You don't know that for sure. And that's the reality. We don't really know where people are. And a lot of the companies that I have worked in aren't checking that. So we're not monitoring people. We're, again, operating with trust and openness and assuming people are where they tell us they are. The way we manage it is through transparency. And we would typically say that people can be outside of their contracted country for 30 working days. So that's 6 weeks of the year, or let's say in a rolling 12 months. It allows people the flexibility to pick up the laptop and go. So maybe instead of doing a 2-week holiday, you do a 4-week holiday and you work for 2 of those. It gives people so much more opportunity, but at the same time, it minimizes that risk to both the individual and to the company. So yeah, you need to be transparent, you need to be upfront. It needs to be a policy, whether formal or informal, that everybody is aware of. Otherwise, it's difficult to have a leg to stand on. If you haven't communicated what your expectations are, if you haven't told people what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, how can they be expected to follow those?
Well, and I think being clear on not only the implications for the company and that you're not just looking out for the company, but you're also looking out for them, because there's all sorts of different implications on the personal side for them that they might not be thinking about as well. So thank you for sharing that, because that was something that I hadn't even heard of. And so I'm glad that you mentioned it. Before I go to Shan with this question, I just want to go back to the poll. So out of the 40% of you that said yes, 67% of you are hiring them as direct employees, and 33% of you are not. Shan, do you have anything to say about those stats at all? And then let's go into what your thoughts are around the global borderless workforce.
Actually, that's quite interesting, because I was expecting it to be the other way around. That implies that a majority of the people attending this call, their companies have already got a strategy and have got the budget in place to actually put the infrastructure in and move on, as opposed to tentatively hire people here and there and see how the wind blows. So I think that's very positive, very encouraging. Secondly, I was hearing what Jackie was saying and thinking to myself, yes, I have a client where we found out that a key employee who's supposed to be in Mexico is actually working out of Buenos Aires because she went home to be with her family during COVID and doesn't intend to go back to Mexico. Not just that, but just taking your own country, Sarah, Canada, into account. It's important actually not just where the employee is, in which country, but where in the country they are. Because in Canada, the different provinces have got different tax rules. And the rules governing whether an employee can be payrolled from a company headquartered, say, in Toronto, but the employee, say, is in Manitoba, depends on a number of factors, including what the employment agreement actually says in terms of where the employee reports to. So if the employee is actually reporting to Ontario, then a payroll run in Ontario is fine, and an adjustment is done by the employee through his annual tax return. But if, on the other hand, the employee is carrying out a core function like sales of the company in that particular province, then the company itself can get taxed on part of its profits in that province. So not only does it affect employees' taxes, it can affect the company's taxes as well, even without the employee having moved out of the country. So it's actually quite important to know where the employee actually is and what the plans are within the country, leave alone between countries.
Absolutely. It's such a great point. And like I said, not something that I've really heard about before. So now I'm going to go over to the audience. We've got some questions. So the first one is, under what circumstances is it appropriate for me to hire an international employee through a PEO or EOR arrangement as opposed to setting up my own infrastructure? And I think that one's going to go over to Shan.
Okay. A PEO is basically an organization that leases employees to you. So you are a co-employer together with the PEO company. The employer of record, the EOR, and PEO, by the way, stands for Professional Employer Organization, but I'm sure we know that. The EOR stands for Employer of Record. And in those circumstances, you're not the employer. The EOR is the employer. You have a contract with the EOR to deliver certain results for you, like running a call center or carrying out a piece of software or R&D project. And the EOR is allocating certain of its employees to supporting you in that project. So there is a kind of subtle but significant distinction between the two. Having said that, you could still be a deemed employer depending on how you interact with and communicate with the employees of the EOR during the course of the execution of a project, if those employees are based in either Europe or Australia or New Zealand or Canada, where deemed employment concept exists. But that risk is very, very low, if not zero, in certain countries like Philippines, Taiwan, where employment risks are generally much lower. So there is a kind of subtle but sure distinction between the two in terms of how you engage or employ foreign persons.
Yeah, and really understanding the requirements for each location to be able to make an intelligent decision about it is really something that we're talking about today, and making sure that you're partnering with the right people as well. Yes. So we've got another question from the audience. Do you have any recommendations on how to build a corporate culture remotely across time zones? Jackie, I'm going to send this one over to you because I think we've touched on it in a variety of different ways, but maybe let's put it into some tangible takeaways.
Yeah, I think we have touched on it. Be open, be intentional, consider employee experience at every element, at every touch point. Something we didn't talk about yet today was leadership training. Make sure that our leaders understand how to lead across cultures, how to lead remotely. Shan talked about managing performance earlier, and I talked a little bit about bias. And one thing that was on my mind was, how do we ensure in a hybrid world in the future that we don't have managers managing performance based on where people are located? So, you know, Jackie sits beside me in the office every day. Jackie's a superstar versus the Jackie who sits 200 miles away. So I think it's really important that we have leader training. And the last element I would say is use your ERGs, or create culture ambassadors. Get people out there who will give you feedback, who will feed into your open, transparent environment, and who will be the people that create the culture, because companies don't create culture. HR people don't create culture. It's just how we are and how things are done. So it's really important to have those people around the world on the ground who are good examples of that.
Yeah, and providing safe spaces so that people do feel like their voices are being heard and they can give constructive feedback that will be taken into consideration. And sometimes that does not come from management. So my last question for the audience is, do I need to update my US employee handbook to include international regulations? Shan, I'm going to send that one over to you.
Yes, yes, and 100 times yes. So, for example, you know, it could be simple things like the minimum amount of paid leave you have to provide an employee. Varies by country. The amount you can claim if you use your own car for business varies by country. But you could also put into it some of the terms and conditions that give you the flexibility to change, as I'd mentioned earlier. I think we already covered that particular one in the course of this discussion, but really my answer is a resounding yes, please do that. And not just your handbook, but also your expenses policy. Many US companies have a US expense policy, but that should be customized to the local country.
That's a great point. And also, making sure that your handbook talks about working remotely from from places other than what you've been hired in the place that you've been hired. Really, really important part and point to really bring up for those handbooks. So to wrap up then, can you each give me maybe one takeaway or sum up from today's discussion that you would like the audience to walk away with, either to put into practice, do right away, or to think about? Jackie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. Be global where possible and local where necessary. Embrace the opportunities that global expansion can bring and expand with intent.
Yeah, embrace the cultures, embrace the time zones, change that mindset to more positivity. I love that. Shan.
Have a plan, have a realistic budget to support the plan, and don't do it on a shoestring. And make sure that you have knowledgeable advisors to help you execute the plan. The last being critical.
Absolutely. And communication, intention, awareness, all of those words as well. What a great note to finish on. Thank you so much, Jackie and Shan. This has been a really insightful discussion. The reality is that the world is opening up. The acceptance of remote working, the uptake of new technologies, working with people around the world is becoming easier, and it has the potential to bring so many benefits. But tackling true global expansion is a challenge, right? The complexities, the compliance. But I always say this in my show, we can't know everything about everything, and it's just not possible, right? But collaboration is the future of business. Filling those knowledge gaps and bolstering your efforts with a trusted partner is truly the way forward, certainly so when it comes to international business. A big thank you to Nucleus for running this webinar and giving us all the chance to get informed and inspired. And if you'd like to find out more, head over to nucleus-co.com. And of course, thank you all for listening and for all of the amazing questions you asked and for the answers to our poll. And as a thank you, we'd like to give you all a free ebook. So look out for that in your email shortly. It'll either be today or tomorrow. And if you have any questions or insights to share from today's webinar, why not head over to social media? You can find Nucleus on LinkedIn. I hope you've all taken a lot of insight and knowledge from our webinar today. I know I have. I was taking notes. I don't know if you guys saw that, but I was taking notes. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Jackie and Shan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.